The airport buzzed with the usual energy of a Monday morning. Announcements echoed overhead, wheels rolled over polished floors, and the smell of overpriced coffee lingered in the air. Business travelers typed furiously on their laptops, families juggled bags and children, and the TSA line snaked endlessly toward security. Amid all the motion, one man moved differently, slower, more cautiously. He wore a faded olive-green jacket, the edges fraying at the seams, and a simple brown cap with a barely visible military insignia embroidered on the front. His khaki slacks were creased, his boots shined but old. A simple black duffel bag hung from his shoulder, worn like the rest of him, practical, modest, and unmistakably military. He didn't command attention. He barely spoke, but something about him made a few passengers pause as he passed. Something about the way he held himself. Tall, despite a slight stoop. Steady, despite a subtle limp. His eyes scanned the terminal with calm calculation, like a man who'd once been trained to assess every possible threat, and never forgot how. As he approached Gate 18, he let out a quiet sigh. The flight to Charlotte was already boarding Group A. He checked his boarding pass again. Group C. Still a while to wait. He stepped forward anyway, clutching a small laminated card in his hand, his retired military ID. The gate agent, a woman in her mid-20s with manicured nails and a Bluetooth headset, was busy typing something into her terminal. When she saw the old man approach, she gave a tight smile, more distracted than warm. "Hi there," the man said softly. His voice had the gravel of age, but was polite, almost gentle. "I was wondering. I've got a bad hip from a service injury. I don't need special treatment, but if there's any chance to board early, it'd help me settle in before the aisles get crowded." He handed her the ID with a careful hand. She glanced at it, then back at him. Her eyes flicked down to his boots, then back up to his face. And then she laughed, a short, dismissive chuckle that wasn't cruel exactly, but full of disbelief. "Sir, you're not on the early boarding list," she said, half turning to glance at the long line forming behind him. "You can board with your group like everyone else." She handed the card back without even really looking at it again. The man gave a small nod. No protest, no anger, just a tired smile. "Of course, I understand." He turned away, taking slow steps toward a chair nearby. As he sat down, one hand gently massaging his hip, a few people in the boarding line looked over. A man in a business suit whispered to his colleague. That looked like a bronze star on his jacket, but neither said anything louder. The gate agent had already moved on, calling up the next group, and the old man? He just sat there quietly, watching planes land and take off, unaware that in just a few minutes, everything in that terminal was about to change. The old man sat quietly by the large glass windows, hands folded over his duffel bag, eyes fixed on the tarmac. His breathing was steady, but every now and then he shifted uncomfortably, massaging his right hip, an old injury that never quite healed right. He didn't grumble. He didn't groan. He just waited. The terminal around him buzzed on. More passengers filtered in, families dragging strollers, teenagers scrolling on their phones, couples arguing softly over boarding times. The gate agent stood at her podium, tapping away at the computer, checking her watch, then calling out, "Group B may now board. Group B." The line formed quickly. The old man stayed seated. His pass clearly said Group C. A young man in his early 30s, wearing noise-canceling headphones and a bomber jacket, gave the old vet a second glance as he passed, but didn't say anything. A middle-aged woman nearby seemed to hesitate, but then focused back on her iPad. Then, with some effort, the old man stood again. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the same military ID he'd shown earlier. This time, he held it a little higher. He walked slowly, steadily, toward the podium again. The agent saw him coming. Her shoulders sank ever so slightly. "Sir, like I said earlier," she began, voice louder now as if rehearsing it for the crowd, "you'll need to wait for Group C. I can't just let everyone board whenever they want." The man nodded again. "I understand, miss. This hip, it locks up sometimes when I have to stand too long. It's nothing dramatic, I promise. Just asking for a little flexibility." The agent crossed her arms. "I'm not trying to be difficult, sir, but I have rules to follow. If I let you board early, everyone else will want to as well." He didn't respond, just gave a slight nod and again turned away. But before he could take a full step, she said, just loud enough for those closest to hear, "You know, just because someone says they were in the military doesn't mean they get special treatment." She laughed again, not cruelly, not maliciously, but dismissively, like a joke to herself, like someone who'd heard too many airport stories from people trying to skip lines. This time, a few heads turned. The businessman from earlier looked up sharply from his laptop. The mother with 2 kids glanced over and gently pulled her son a little closer. A young woman near the boarding line whispered to her boyfriend, "Did she just laugh at him?" The old man heard it. That part he did hear. He stopped walking. His jaw clenched slightly, and he took a long, steady breath through his nose. Still, he didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out. Instead, he turned to her calmly and said, "Ma'am, I served 27 years. I buried friends. I came home with shrapnel in my leg and more in my heart. I'm not asking for anything free, just a seat on a plane and a little grace while I get there." That silenced her for a moment. But the gate agent, trying to regain control of the situation, said with forced cheerfulness, "We appreciate your service, sir, but I still have to follow policy." The man nodded once more, and then he turned and sat back down in the same chair by the window, the military ID still gripped in his weathered hand. The terminal grew noticeably quieter. A hush settled over the area near Gate 18. There was tension now, like people were waiting to see what would happen next. No one knew it yet, but someone else had just landed. Someone important. Someone who did know exactly who that old man was. And in a matter of minutes, the tone of the entire terminal and the young woman at the podium was going to change dramatically. The air in Gate 18 had shifted. It wasn't something you could see, but you could feel it. The kind of quiet that settles over a crowd when people aren't sure whether they've just witnessed something wrong or just let it happen. The old man had returned to his seat. He sat with his hands folded tightly over his military ID, now resting in his lap. His face was neutral, unreadable, but his eyes, those quiet, stormy eyes, stared out over the tarmac with a kind of restrained dignity that said more than any words ever could. The laughter still echoed faintly in the minds of those who'd heard it. The tone, the timing, and the weight of it. 2 rows back, a father traveling with his teenage son leaned in and whispered, "That wasn't right." His son looked over at the old man. Was he really in the military? The father nodded. "Jacket looks authentic. Bronze star, maybe even a combat infantryman badge, and that limp. You don't fake something like that." A middle-aged woman with a designer tote bag sat silently near the window. She'd been scrolling through vacation photos a few minutes earlier. Now she was watching the man with a different kind of gaze. Softened, reflective. Her own father had served in Vietnam, had the same faraway look in his eyes when someone brought up the war. Near the boarding line, a young couple whispered quietly, "She really laughed at him?" The woman asked. The man nodded. "Yeah, right after he said he had a bad hip, like he was making it up." "That's awful," she said, glancing at the gate agent, who now avoided looking anywhere in his direction. Even the businessman in the tailored suit, the one who hadn't looked up from his laptop in over half an hour, had closed the lid. He wasn't scrolling emails anymore. He was watching, taking mental notes. There was a time when he might have dismissed a moment like that. Today, something felt different. Something had changed. A TSA officer slowly strolled by the gate, doing a routine walkthrough. He gave a slight nod to the gate agent, who returned it stiffly, trying to act unaffected, but her shoulders were tense. Her face had lost its earlier smugness. Even her cheery tone calling the next group sounded flat. "Group C, now boarding. Group C." No one moved. People just stared. The old man made no attempt to rise. He didn't look at the gate again. He just waited, calm, quiet, composed, his dignity intact, even if others had failed to offer him any. One little girl, maybe 7 or 8, walked over from her parents' row and stood beside him for a moment. She didn't say anything, just looked at him curiously. Her mother quickly got up and gently pulled her back. "Come on, sweetheart, let's not bother him." But the old man smiled softly and gave the girl a small nod. Behind the gate desk, the agent's fingers tapped nervously at her keyboard. Her eyes kept drifting toward the far side of the terminal. She looked like someone waiting for backup, or trouble. A few feet away, a man with salt and pepper hair and a camera bag slung over his shoulder reached into his carry-on and pulled out a folded newspaper. He carefully tore out the crossword puzzle page, scribbled something on the back, and walked quietly over to the old man. "Sir," he said gently, "my uncle served in Korea. Didn't say much about it, but when he did, I listened. Just wanted you to know some of us still remember." He handed the folded paper to the old man, who took it with a nod. Written on the back in small but firm letters were just 6 words. "You earned far more than this." The old man said nothing, just placed the paper inside his coat pocket. And still, no one moved to board. The gate agent cleared her throat, louder this time. "Group C, final call." 1 or 2 hesitant passengers began to stand, but just then a sharp click echoed from the far end of the gate area, the sound of a secure access door opening. A ripple passed through the crowd. 2 men in uniform stepped through, not airport security, military dress blues, sharp, crisp, polished shoes, clean caps, medals displayed with purpose. And behind them, walking with slow, deliberate steps, was a tall figure wearing a decorated officer's coat, the kind of man whose very presence commanded a room without saying a single word. The passengers turned toward the sight. Conversation stopped. Phones were lowered, and even the gate agent's face drained of color as she realized who had just walked into the terminal. The hush turned to awe. Something was happening, and somehow, it was for him. A hushed silence blanketed Gate 18. Passengers stood frozen mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-thought, as if someone had pressed pause on the entire terminal. The sharp lines of the military uniforms, the gleaming shoes, the impeccable medals, they commanded not just attention, but reverence. The gate agent, who had been exuding confidence just 10 minutes earlier, now stood rigid behind her podium, blinking rapidly as her eyes darted between the approaching officers and the old man she had dismissed only moments ago. The tall figure behind the 2 uniformed escorts moved with precision, every step measured, every gesture deliberate. He was older, likely in his late 50s, with silvering hair beneath a sharply pressed cap, but he stood tall, his shoulders squared like a man still active in the chain of command. And he was headed straight for the old man in the green jacket. Before he reached him, the airport speakers crackled to life. "Attention passengers, Flight 342 to Charlotte is experiencing a brief delay due to arrival of a priority individual. We appreciate your patience." Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Some turned to one another, whispering, "Did they say priority individual? Is this about him?" Even those who had remained silent during the earlier exchange were now on full alert. People stepped aside instinctively as the officers walked past, like they understood they were in the presence of something, or someone, more important than they had realized. The old man still sat quietly, his head tilted slightly as he listened to the announcement. He hadn't moved since the last group was called, but as the footsteps neared him, he slowly turned. The moment their eyes met, it was like time paused. The decorated officer came to a full stop in front of him. Then, in full view of the stunned terminal, he removed his cap, straightened his stance, and executed a perfect salute. Not rushed, not symbolic. A full, proper regulation salute. "Colonel James McAllister," the man said clearly, his voice carrying through the terminal. "Sir, it is my honor to greet you." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. People who had dismissed the old man as just another aging traveler now stared with wide eyes. The old man, Colonel McAllister, blinked once. Slowly, he set down his duffel, stood with effort, and returned the salute with a slow, steady hand. "At ease, General," he replied quietly. "Didn't expect to be met like this." The general offered a warm smile. "Sir, when my staff informed me you'd be on this flight, I instructed my crew to hold boarding until I could greet you myself." The gate agent's jaw fell slightly. She looked around helplessly as if hoping someone would tell her this was all some kind of elaborate prank. No one did. Passengers began pulling out their phones, not to film but to take quiet photos. The mood was reverent now. Eyes were misty. A few older travelers stood and placed hands over their hearts. The general turned toward the gate agent, still standing behind her podium. "Miss," he said, his voice still calm but with the weight of command, "did this gentleman request early boarding?" She fumbled for words. I wasn't sure if he didn't have special clearance on his ticket, and..." "That gentleman," the general interrupted, "is a Bronze Star recipient, a Vietnam veteran, and the reason people like you and I have the freedom to argue about boarding order." He paused. "Make it right." The agent swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." She stepped from behind the podium and walked toward Colonel McAllister, eyes lowered. "Sir," she said softly, "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. If you'll allow me, I'd be honored to escort you to the plane now." The colonel simply nodded, gracious as ever. "No harm done, young lady. You'll learn." And just like that, he picked up his bag. The general placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, and together the two veterans began walking toward the jet bridge. As they passed through the gate, passengers rose from their seats, first in twos, then fours, then the entire waiting area. A standing ovation, not loud or raucous, but quiet, sincere, and deeply moving. Applause that came from a place beyond politeness, from respect, from awe. The little girl who had stood beside him earlier clapped softly next to her parents. The businessman who had once ignored him now stood tall, eyes damp. And behind them, in that corner seat by the window, the silence left by Colonel McAllister's absence now felt like hallowed ground. The jet bridge doors had barely closed behind Colonel McAllister and the general, yet the emotional weight of their departure still lingered in the gate area like the echo of a national anthem. Passengers slowly began to sit down again, many in thoughtful silence. Some dabbed their eyes discreetly, others simply stared out the windows, processing what they'd just witnessed. It wasn't every day you watched a forgotten veteran receive the honor he'd quietly earned decades ago. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. From the far end of the terminal, a young man in jeans and a plain black hoodie walked briskly toward Gate 18. He wasn't flashy. No uniform, no luggage, just a single envelope in one hand and a determined look on his face. He approached the gate agent, who was still visibly shaken, and said calmly, "Is Colonel McAllister already on board?" The agent blinked. Yes, he just boarded a few minutes ago. May I ask who you are?" The young man gave a small smile. "I'm his grandson." The passengers nearby turned again, murmurs rising. "He has family here?" "No one mentioned a grandson." The agent straightened. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know." "It's okay," the young man said kindly. "He doesn't know I came. He thinks I'm still stationed overseas." Now everyone nearby was listening. The young man continued, "I got leave approved last night. Took a red-eye to surprise him. He raised me after my dad died in Afghanistan. Man taught me everything. Discipline, honor, humility. I told him I couldn't make his flight today because of duty, but..." He held up the envelope. "He forgot this. It's the letter he wrote to my dad before his last deployment. He reads it before every trip, says it keeps him grounded." A hush returned to the crowd. The gate agent stepped aside. "Come with me." But before she could escort him down the jet bridge, the gate phone rang. She answered quickly, nodded several times, then looked up at the young man. "Sir," she said, "the general would like you to board personally. They're holding the flight." The young man grinned, emotion welling in his eyes. "Thank you." As he was led through the gate, a wave of warmth and admiration followed him. One older gentleman whispered, "Like grandfather, like grandson." A woman nearby added, "Now that's a legacy." Just before disappearing down the jet bridge, the young man turned back and gave a short nod to the passengers who had stayed, some of whom still stood silently in respect. And then he was gone. Moments later, the loudspeaker crackled again. "Final boarding call for Flight 342. We thank you for your patience." But no one was in a hurry to board. They weren't thinking about seat numbers or overhead bins anymore. They were thinking about the man who had walked quietly among them, the woman who had dismissed him, and the grandson who had returned to deliver a piece of memory, a piece of heart, just in time. The kind of story no one had expected, but no one would forget. Back in Gate 18, the crowd had thinned, but the atmosphere remained sacred, like the place itself had been touched by something larger than life. The final boarding call had passed. The flight was sealed. The journey had resumed, but for many still seated in the waiting area, for those on delayed flights, for airport staff now whispering about what they'd just seen, the moment lingered like incense in the air. It was then, just minutes before the boarding screen flipped to "departed," that something unexpected happened. The door at the jet bridge cracked open once more. Colonel McAllister emerged, not rushed, not flustered, just steady. He stepped out slowly and looked around the terminal, his eyes scanning until they landed on the exact chair where he'd been sitting less than an hour ago, and he walked straight to it. Passengers who had remained behind straightened in their seats. Conversation stopped. Even music from the nearby cafe faded into the background. He picked up something he had left behind. Not his duffel, not a cane, but the small, folded crossword puzzle page, the one handed to him by the man with the camera bag. He looked at it, paused, and then turned slowly to face the terminal. And just then, without fanfare, without warning, he stood tall, brought his heels together, and delivered a single, crisp salute to the gate, to the people, to all of them, not as a gesture of pride, but of thanks. For the whispers, for the second looks, for standing up when it mattered, for remembering. It was the kind of salute that came from decades of service, refined not by ceremony, but by sacrifice, a gesture not taught, but earned. And slowly, like a ripple moving across water, people stood again. One by one, quietly, respectfully, they rose to their feet. A janitor nearby removed his cap and held it over his chest. The cafe barista stepped out from behind the counter, her hand instinctively resting at her heart. A family of 5 stood together, the father gently guiding his 2 small sons to attention. Even the gate agent, still behind her podium, stood tall, both hands flat on the counter, her eyes glistening with something more honest than regret. And in that stillness, a hush even deeper than before swept the terminal. No claps, no cheers, just one man's quiet salute, returned by the respect of an entire room. It wasn't protocol, it wasn't policy, it was something far rarer than either. It was honor. After a long moment, Colonel McAllister lowered his hand. He gave a small nod to the room, folded the crossword paper once more, tucked it into his jacket, and turned toward the jet bridge. No words spoken, no applause needed, but everyone knew. They'd just witnessed something that would live in their memories longer than any flight number, and long after the plane had vanished into the clouds, long after the chairs had been rearranged, long after the screen refreshed. The story of Gate 18 would remain, the story of one forgotten veteran who was no longer forgotten. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the gate agent, Emily, remained frozen behind her podium. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the counter's edge. Her perfectly rehearsed airline smile was gone. In its place, a cold flush of realization crawling up her neck and into her face. She had just watched a man she dismissed, saluted by a general, honored by passengers, and followed into the plane by a grandson in uniform. And now she couldn't stop hearing the words in her head. That gentleman is a Bronze Star recipient, and the reason people like you and I have the freedom to argue about boarding order. They echoed like a verdict. Passengers who had glared earlier now walked past her in silence. Some shook their heads, some didn't look at her at all. But one older woman paused just long enough to whisper, "You should have known better." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had started the day in control. Polished blazer, flight announcements rolling off her tongue, coffee in hand, and a checklist in mind. She knew the policy. Priority boarding for military in uniform, not just anyone with a camo jacket and a cane. And yet, the man's gentle voice, his steady gaze, there had been something about him. Something she ignored, not because she was cruel, but because she was in a hurry, because she assumed, because it was easier to see a tired old man than a war hero. Now, with every seat taken and the terminal finally quiet, the shame sat heavy in her chest, like a weight pressing against her ribs. She looked down at the boarding screen and tapped a few keys, pretending to busy herself. Anything to avoid the stares, anything to hide from what she now knew was her failure. Suddenly, a hand rested on the counter. She looked up, half expecting another scolding. It was the businessman from earlier, the one who had watched everything unfold from 3 seats back. He didn't say anything, just placed something on the counter, a small, laminated military ID, his own. "I was going to board early, too," he said quietly. "Decided not to when I saw how you treated him." Emily swallowed hard. "I didn't," she started, but the words failed. He gave a faint smile, not unkind, but firm. "It's not always about policy. Sometimes it's about paying attention." He picked up his ID, tucked it away, and walked off. She stood there, shoulders stiff, trying to breathe through the weight in her chest. A soft ding came from the airport phone. She picked it up, her voice faint. "Gate 18, Agent Monroe speaking." A pause. Her eyes widened. "Yes, sir. Of course." She hung up slowly. That voice on the phone, it was from airline headquarters. Word had already reached them. The general, the salute, the crowd, the delay. And now, her name was tied to the moment for all the wrong reasons. She looked out the window at the plane taxiing toward the runway. A tear slid down her cheek before she could catch it, not because she was afraid, but because somewhere out there, on that flight, sat a man who had done everything right, and a woman on the ground who had done everything wrong. And for the first time in her fast-moving career, Emily Monroe understood what it truly meant, to be humbled. 2 weeks had passed since the unforgettable day at Gate 18, The story had made national headlines. Colonel saluted by General at Gate 18. Crowd stands in ovation. Veteran's quiet dignity sparks viral moment of respect. Gate agent sparks outrage, then surprises everyone. And at the center of it all was Emily Monroe. For days she had avoided the news, avoided the comments, even avoided the uniformed service members she once casually waved past in the terminal. Until one morning, she woke up, looked at herself in the mirror, and realized avoiding wasn't the answer. Acknowledging was. So she made a decision. Back at Gate 18, she stood behind the same podium, but this time with something new pinned to her blazer, a small flag pin above her name badge, gifted to her by a local veterans group. And, in her hands, a sealed envelope. When Flight 342 returned on its usual route 2 days later, she watched the manifest. He was on it. Colonel McAllister. He stepped off the jet bridge slowly, just as calm and steady as before. Before he could head to baggage claim, she approached. "Sir," she said, her voice soft but sure. He turned. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "I owe you an apology," she continued, "but I also wanted to say thank you for what you did, for who you are. I've learned more in the last 2 weeks than I did in all my years at this job." She handed him the envelope. Just something small, from the team, and from me. Colonel McAllister took it without a word, opened it, read the short note inside, then looked up and smiled. "You stood up," he said. "That's what matters." She blinked back tears. "I'll never sit down again." And as he walked away, she didn't return to the podium right away. She stood there quietly, one hand over her heart, watching a hero fade into the crowd. This time, not forgotten, not ignored, but forever respected. And this time, because of her.